I should have brought my microphone with me. I guess I'll do that in the future. Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm now synthesizing, I think, quite firmly the problems in culture to a large extent, and it's really right there, right at the beginning of the scriptures in Genesis, when it talks about gods as themselves or unto themselves or something like that. It uses the plural, it uses the collective form in terms of the promise that the serpent intrigues and seduces Eve with in the second creation story. But so let me say this, is that anyway, I mean, that's on a very archetypal sort of level, symbolic kind of level. Let me get into the nitty-gritty. So we can see that the problem the problem that we have is the devoided, negated importance of faith. That faith is replaced by a faith in something that doesn't have a doctrine attached to it. So I've just moved my phone now, so hopefully the sound is not too bad. And faith essentially becomes devoid of that term that is now very seldom used and often scorned and scoffed at, which is doctrine. Is that faith becomes a nebulous, gelatinous kind of conformity to some kind of environ, some kind of setting, some kind of place, which is itself not amicable to doctrine, or at least, yeah. Now, there is, I think, a general solution to this, which is that we can cohabit the world together with people of different doctrines. We can tolerate differences, but we have to, at least in a disciplined way, we can have our cake and eat it with a certain basic, even doctrinal thing, which will perhaps not be conducive, or at least assimilatable by some forms of belief, which I do think are eminently defective and evil forms of belief, or let's just say doctrine that is so convoluted, which is so premised on projection onto others and confabulating its own selective, recent memories, long-term memories, medium memories, in this gelatinous kind of narrative, in which the narrative needs to stay in some picturesque sense. And I do think that essentially there is a culture, an individual culture, which is, let's say, doctrinally resonant with many different forms of faith and religion even, and other forms of belief structures, because I think that they do have a common root, essentially. But I mean, that's an ontological sort of historical sentiment and estimation, and that as well is not compatible with some people's beliefs. But you could also say that there's an epistemological correspondence then that some people might be able to resonate with, in terms of if you're not happy with the ontological narrative. So in such a wise, I am not hitched to my own narrative about this. It doesn't, because the narrative isn't what makes it true, it's somewhat the fruit of it that makes it true. But perhaps now let me stop talking so flowery and just get into what specifically that I mean in terms of how you can have your cake and eat it in, let's just say, a common place for people to share and to speak of things of faith, but also be able to discuss doctrine responsibly, or at least to not divorce those two topics. And that would be specifically the discerning individual. That we cannot allow ourselves to be, let's say, denigrated by, let's say, structures of belief which are wedded and invested and entrenched, in fact, in the fact that they are comporting a vital piece of a puzzle in which their culture collectively renders some kind of discerning contribution. This is anathema to the spirit. This is anathema to, and this is all my opinion. I cannot say that I'm offering anything other than my own philosophical metaphysic. And I must concede that I might be wrong. I don't believe I am wrong, but I must concede that I might be. But how do we ever hash this out if we do not engage as discerning individuals? There's no hope of resolution then, unless one can find and unlock, let's say, the hidden authority locked away, or at least one can make a differing narrative inside of the other person's So yeah, the discerning individual, which is quite frankly overrun when confronted with another individual who speaks for the might of the collective, who speaks on behalf of the communal value, as it were. Especially in some sense when such a loose organization, which is a church but not a church, perhaps is ambiguous, does not have the leadership, does not have the organizational proficiency in order to do anything other than to produce a puzzle box or an offering of some kind of entreatment that seeks to resolve by exposition and therefore perpetuate the ambiguity. So we have this never-ending sort of cacophony, if I might use words that I don't fully understand, but I'm trying to poetically say that the snake might shed its skin, but it's still camouflaged by its environs. It's still contained within the pattern of the external locus of control of this worldly camouflage, in which it is fine to be thus. But I just am a voice speaking on behalf of the importance of doctrine, and faith without doctrine is not a sound faith. And discussions of faith without essentially getting to grips with doctrine and, let's say, the need for the justification in doctrine, and And you could say that some faiths are at a fundamental disadvantage in such a wise, because especially the old ones, I mean, especially the Hindus, especially, in fact, as well as, let's say, the root Abrahamic, Brahmanic cultures that emerged, you know, the Vedic culture, which lost its own voice. I mean, it is still sung, but it's a singing language. It's not a spoken language. It's a sung language, and I wonder how much the language of the Israelites might suffer from the same defect, and the language in which you cannot, well, in the modern sense, in the, let's say, in its strange project of recovery, how much of it has it actually you can't curse in modern Hebrew. Did you know that? You cannot swear. There are no swear words. It's quite obscure. I wonder to the extent to which any slang exists whatsoever. I mean, it's an academically expert, intellectual, elite promulgation, at least the modern project of recovering Hebrew. But I wonder how much of that is a living. Anyway, I mean, language is I mean, this means nothing without some kind of context, but and I'm alluding to perhaps symbolic layers upon layers upon layers of turtles upon turtles upon turtles, and at some point we actually have to recognize, what does our doctrine tell us where we begin? Are we part of this of an eternal, endless material plane? Was there a Big Bang? Was there an atom, or was spiritual life begun at a certain point, and perhaps then, you know, the waveform collapsed, sustained and maintained? And how old is the universe really then? I mean, what does it even mean to speak about the age of something? When was our consciousness that is interesting how the Greeks saw things, that the light extended from the eyes, not into the eyes. And I would argue that, I mean, you can't talk of Greece, in the ancient world, because it wasn't, or with so many different various city-states and such. But if you could say that Greece, in totality, was a sister city of Phoenicia, I think there's often more value in the sister cities than there are in the father cities, because the sister cities are not conformed to dogma, they're not conformed to the project, they're conformed only to the essence that can be gleaned in the understanding. And the combination of sister and father well, somewhere between those two, there is hope that there might be a son of both of those old systems of things, that the Son of Man, which is spoken about often, at least in the Christian recovery of the Hebrew, I wouldn't even just call it Hebrew. I mean, Job. Was Job really a Hebrew? Is Job in, my ignorance, is Job in, in the written Torah? I mean, my strange understanding is that Job is on the other side of, well, he's quite far towards the east, in fact. But I mean, that is not to say that. So I wonder how much of this is a culture and how much of this is a. How much of this was a spiritual compact between brethren, between spiritual brethren. And there are far-flung churches. I mean, in Revelations it speaks of 7 churches and 7 lampstands. Anyway, I'm now talking as a rambling transpersonal mystic. So I'll just button my mouth now and say that there are deeper stories, there are deeper mysteries. You know, the famous saying, there are greater things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. And I wonder if we don't need perhaps a culture of a discerning individual that can allow us to explore and also to dispel perhaps the half-baked crack pottery which gets a free ride so often in what is, you know, the faux harmoniousness of the cacophony of the I mean, have you ever seen a I don't even know what it's called, but it's certainly strange when snakes are mating with one another in I don't know what it's called. They do it in bundles. They do it in, I mean, it looks absolutely it's creepy to say the least, because, you know, animals are always dangerous when they've got some kind of sexual, you know, I mean, you can be very friendly to lions, you can be friendly to bears, but, you know, if you smell like something that has a kind of you know, if you bring weird pheromones of menstrual cycles into the proximity of, you know, it creates a sexual confusion, and in that sexual confusion you get a very strange form of mechanical intellectualism, and people that were friends with bears suddenly get eaten because there was a woman that came between them, because there was and perhaps this is the meaning of the Jezebel to some degree, but people don't realize that, you know, the serpent is a broad classification within the animal kingdom. We have reptilian innards, we have reptilian organelles, as it were, self-preservation, sexual preservation, perhaps in the course of preservation. And when we see a place for ourselves and a place for our future in some reptilian fashion, in which we have actually inclined ourselves towards a faithless form of, is this not the history of the Nazi philosophy? The family of the nation state, the family unit of the infantilism. And I think being a discerning individual in the midst of these kinds of forces will give us the clarity to be able to find community and be able to found decent community. I think. Perhaps I speak beyond my remit. I have been told that to rescue someone from the world is also a curse if they be without spiritual brethren, if they be without a brotherhood of the Spirit. Which is there to be shared in by sisters, because I speak not of the material sense of these things, I speak of the spiritual significances. That the thought form in the mind is masculine, that the at least in its origin, the spirit is masculine, the soul is feminine, is essentially the famous, obviously everything is controversial. You find another philosophy that has a slightly different spin on it, and I would say in the understanding it all becomes reconciled. But anyway, that is for the fields of Calvary, that is for the fields of testimony.